This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. After Koom attended the Toronto Comic Arts Festival in May, he continued interviewing creators. This week, a talk with Ethan Rilly, creator of the comic Pope Hats. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics. We're at the Jet Fuel with
Ethan Rilly.
The Jet Fuel's got great alternative comics cachet here in Toronto. So you're in town because you were promoting Pope Hats number... Is that 5 now?
Yeah, it's 5. I wouldn't say I'm promoting it. I'm just in town for TCAF. I don't think I've ever promoted anything in my life. But we just released number 5, and it's been fun to get it out there.
Okay, great. I gotta say, your stuff's amazing. I feel very lucky to, be catching you for an interview at this point in your career before I think you'll get immense amount of acclaim, especially when your stuff's collected. Is that the plan for, has the storyline wrapped up now?
Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of early days yet, but we're planning to collect the main story, which begins in issue number 2. It's the story about these two girls named Frances and Vicky. And issue 5, I guess, would represent the second half of this graphic novel. So I'm not certain what I'm going to be doing in the future, if I'm going to continue with these two characters. But certainly the storyline in those 3 issues has ended for me.
Then do you not count issue 1? Because it does feature those 2 characters and has some really nice stuff. Like the ghost kind of disappears, so I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, issue number 1 came at a different time. I think there's a large gap of years between issues 1 and 2.
What are the years that they came out?
Issue 1 came out in, I think, 2009. I'd probably done most of the material for it sometime before that. The story behind that is I actually was lucky enough to get a Xeric Foundation grant, which is it's money that basically comes out of the Ninja Turtles franchise that one of the creators was nice enough to put aside. Yeah, I think it's actually Peter.
Is it Peter? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
But he put aside money every year for cartoonists to be able to self-publish their works. And when it still existed, I applied for a grant kind of on a whim, and I got it. So I was able to publish Pope Hats number 1 and do kind of things like distribute it through Diamond Comics, stuff that you wouldn't be able to do on your own at that stage. And so, some of the work in that comic is actually from quite some time before 2009. But that was issue number 1. And I think a lot of things were going on in my life at that time. So it took some time to get to a point where I had space and time to work on issue number 2. And by that point, I feel like looking back on the first issue, I wasn't entirely satisfied with it. It wasn't really representative of exactly what was in my head. So I kind of regrouped, and I tried to be a bit more ambitious with number 2, and I tried to get a bit more serious about what I would consider in scope and out of scope of the story. And I really didn't want to have a sort of that kind of overt fantasy element of a ghost talking. It just seemed kind of gimmicky to me. So I decided not to explain it at all, and just skip the whole ghost part and focus on the kind of the inner workings of the lives of these 2 characters for issue number 2.
I think I loved issue number 1. I only read it recently because I picked up the issues that I hadn't read. I think like the sense of humor is very assured, even with the ghost, and I think your art style is still kind of evolving a little bit before it kind of hits that, I don't know, Christmas or whatever that you have in the second issue. But also you do have those supernatural elements where Franny's just kind of facing the reader and telling those stories in the restaurant, and I think that's lovely, like just that style and whatever. But we can talk about the subsequent story, because I think that is sort of like
I'd be happy to talk about number 1 if you wanted to. It's just the funny thing that was going on in my head at the time was, I think I recall working on the story of number 1, and to be honest, at that stage I was just experimenting. I did a mini comic about these characters before issue number 1. That was fun. And then I did this story that is, God, I don't even know what happens in this story. Not much, but it's about them kind of, going out to parties and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember when I worked on it, I didn't have any intention to show it to anyone, not even the closest friends of mine. I was just working on, the basic, kind of figuring out the medium of comics. And
how old were you at the time?
Oh, I think I had a late start with art, so I think I was in my late 20s. But when I worked on this story, I definitely did not intend for anyone to see it. And probably just, I think I might have like dared myself by applying for a Xeric grant late night some night, and then was surprised when I got it. And that kind of, it was like having your bluff called. And so I was forced to put it out.
What was involved in the Xeric application? Did you submit the pages you had, or did you write a whole treatment, or?
I really can't remember. I think I just sent them a portion of the story, and then I did more work after I got the grant. But it's probably just as it is in the first issue. But yeah, I just, the one thing about issue number 1 is it was worked on without any intention for anyone to see it. And I think at one point when I finished it, when you work on a comic for a long time, and then you actually have a chance to read it in one go, you actually have a kind of a sense of how it flows and whether it holds up. And I think the first time I read it through, and this isn't rare for me, I read it through and I hated it. I was like, this was a massive failure. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. So yeah, it's kind of like, when you put out a work like that, it's easy to feel ambivalent about it and not really recall, why you did it. But looking back now, I'm kind of fond of the issue.
Yeah, you should be. I mean, it's like when you read early issues of Love and Rockets and you see Maggie and Hopi then, and you compare them to Maggie and Hopi, like, once that stuff hits its stride, and even Maggie and Hopi later, like, there's no, like, it would be a loss if that early stuff was, it's just really lovely, and there's a real natural talent, as is with you. But we should, since you were talking about, like, getting a comic together and all of that, I guess I want to ask you, if you put it out in your late 20s, or you were working on it in your late 20s, what did you do in undergrad? Did you think you'd do something else in life? Did your family expect you to do something else in life? Was it hard to kind of find your way to this?
I've been lucky in that I think, my family have never really had any intense expectations for what I would do. I was lucky enough to go to university, and I did my undergrad in Montreal at McGill. I studied psychology. I think the idea I had for a long time, even after university, was just to kind of, any inclination I had towards making art, to kind of stifle it, because it's not very wise as a career choice. It's not really a career at all, but I really wanted to just like find a job that I would be able to that might be a bit beneficial to society, trying to help out people. And I never really did any sort of art outside of high school. But then it kind of, it's like, it's a thing. It's like, it was kind of a theme of my life at the time that it kind of kept creeping back into my life. I would just, I guess, keep sketchbooks, and I would try to really, I think in university I was pretty serious. I really tried to focus on studying, and I think it was partly like, being aware of how much money you're spending for tuition and living costs.
And I don't know about you, but in Montreal, there wasn't a great place where you could get English indie comics.
Yeah, so what happened was there was a store on, Drawn and Quarterly were based in Montreal. I wasn't aware.
But they didn't have a store then.
I mean, I had stopped reading, that's right, I had stopped reading comics a long time ago. Like, I had stopped in early high school, just because I guess I sort of lost interest. That's to say that I wasn't reading, like, good alternative comics. I was reading, X-Men and kind of like just buying them out of loyalty to the franchise and hoping that I would get a glint of, how I felt when I was 11, 12 reading those stories. But, nothing ever comes out of that. It's kind of, those sorts of stories are really geared towards, a younger audience, I think. It's really good for people who are, I guess, like, just coming out of puberty and wanting to, escape the world in a way. I'm not sure.
Or it's the power fantasy, right? It's the
power
fantasy world.
I guess, like, it's hard because, like, I haven't, I wouldn't be able to self-analyze why I was interested in it. But in any case, I lost interest in comics. This was probably one of 3 times that I just stopped reading comics altogether. And, at the same time, it's not like I was not interested in art. I was watching a lot of movies I liked, and I was reading more novels at that time. So by the time university came around, I was just probably not interested in comics at all. And then I lucked upon, there was a store on Saint Laurent. It was on the west side, the Main in Montreal, as they call it. It was called Mojo. It was sort of like a little curated shop that had little knickknacks and like vintage clothes. And the back wall of the store was almost all devoted to Drawn and Quarterly books.
I know it. I bought a couple of hate issues there, which is not D&Q.
I'd never seen it before, and I remember, this was probably 2000. I saw issues of Louis Riel, and I remember flipping through them, not being interested. I was like, Canadian history, boring. Mm-hmm. I remember Julie Doucet, Dirty Plot. I picked those up, loved them. I remember Optic Nerve. It was probably around issue 7 or 8, something like that. But they had a lot of these comics, and I was just really, I read them, and I was like, the experience of reading comics then was just, it was really eye-opening. I'd read an issue of Dirty Plot or Optic Nerve, and I'd think to myself, like, what was that? Like, it kind of bent any expectation I had for comics. Soon after that, I remember reading Jimmy Corrigan, and that was a big thing. It was very confusing. I was like, what is this drawing style? I thought it was like an IKEA catalog. And then, the big shock of that is just how intensive the emotions are of that story, and how kind of the depth of it, in terms of, father and son relationships. And it's an epic story. So, clearly at this time, trying to study, really trying not to follow up on my interest in art, and but being blown away by certain stories I'm reading, and then I think after a couple of years I started doing just kind of nonsense humor strips for our campus weekly newspaper. It's kind of a common thing for alternative comics, I think, cartoonists, I think. So I did that secretly. I wouldn't tell any of my friends because I was kind of ashamed of making comics, but that was fun. The campus paper really liked them.
This is the McGill Daily?
Yeah. There was the Tribute and there was the Daily. I did stuff for the Daily. They were like the artsier paper, kind of the more experimental one. And then, from there, it's actually I kind of also stopped that. I worked for a long time after university, and I didn't do anything. But whenever I had free time, I would try my hand at comics, and I always had this idea that I'd like to try a longer storyline. It's kind of a circuitous path, but I eventually got a chance to do that once I got the Xeric grant, and everything's been perfect since then.
That's funny, because like when I was reading your stuff, I thought this guy's read all of that same generation of stuff that I've read. He's read Tomine, he's read Chester Brown, he's read, you mentioned Julie Doucette, but I wasn't thinking of Doucette, I was thinking of like Jessica Abel maybe, and it just all seems like blended in there. And it's strange because I think for me that generation had affected me sort of maybe similar to the way you talked about it. It was like an eye-opening thing that just made an impression. And yours is sort of like half a generation afterwards. That's kind of
like I was definitely reading these books after they were out. You know, like I had never read a copy of Yummy Fur, and I appreciate that how much of a cultural thing that was at the time. You know, to wait for an issue of that must have been just mind-blowing to see that work come out. I mean, like I remember going into like a superhero comic store as a kid. Like I remember this very distinctly because like I'm familiar with Chester. Like I'm friends with him. I see him every now and then. So he's just like a guy I like to joke around with. But back then, I went into a store. I'm a kid. I'm reading X-Men and Image comics. But I'm also kind of, it's like I'm interested in all art. And I see this issue of Yummy Fur. It's kind of weird. And I take it down from the shelf and I flip through it. And it was that issue of Yummy Fur that was a self-contained kind of just it was a tone poem. It was like a trippy story about Sookyun Lee, and she's floating over this like castle city. And I saw that, and the panels were like intuitive on the page. It wasn't like a grid of like 9 panels per page.
I think he used to draw those panels as singles and just sort of paste them together.
That's right. I think he kind of still does that. But I saw it at the time. I'd never seen anything like that, and I remember thinking at the time, this is too much for me. I'm not mature enough to take this in. It was like too powerful. So I just put it back and without having any design for it, I later really got into Chester stuff. It's he's one of the most incredible artists.
It's a texture, I find. It just really seeps into you. It stays with you. Those images. It's
true. There's something really like tactile about his work and the way he shades his work, but also his personality. He kind of his character really bleeds through all of his stuff.
It really comes through. Whereas in person, I find he's a bit more reserved or whatever, but on paper, it really does come through.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how other people see him, but I guess I'm comfortable enough with him to like talk about really mindless things, and I don't see him too differently than other people. But yeah, I mean certainly when you read his stuff and you don't know him, and you read his stuff, against other artists, there's nothing like him. It's incredible. Like an artist like that comes, once a generation. It's like a Kubrick or something like that. Someone who's just incapable of not being themselves in terms of making art.
Absolutely. He's got such a strong conduit for the page, and Seth said, in a dedication or something, or a blurb or something, I really think he's the best cartoonist, of my generation or whatever. And I don't think that's over embellished, I think, or maybe he said best in the country or something like that. But I do want to get back to your main story with Frances and Vicky, and Frances is kind of, struggling with her, I guess, lack of boundaries of character or whatever, as she kind of is an actress. Sorry, I'm talking about Vicky. Vicky becomes an actress, and then she gets, the call to Hollywood, and then that sort of seems to snap her more into place, and she's still struggling, but it's whereas Frances is sort of herself, and she's the character that you're sort of more centered around. At least it feels like the story's more subjective through her eyes, and she's dealing with working as a law clerk at this very kind of, you've got all these touches. There's so many things I can relate to that I just can't. I used to work as a process server.
Really?
Although mostly
That's so
my job was just it was a couple of summers in between, when I was at U of T, and it was just picking up and delivering from clients. There was very little actual where I'd surprise somebody and like, you're being served. It was mostly lawyers who were expecting it because they were doing divorce proceedings or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you're filing stuff with the courts on time. You're keeping schedules.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I had this, I did a lot of, what would you call it, drafts of the story for the last issue, and I don't know, my imagination gets away with me sometimes. So there are a lot of strands of story that I ultimately threw out the window, and one of them was, I think it had to do with process servers and kind of their position in the larger picture of the firm and how they were viewed as, I mean, it was kind of like this underground race of people that they needed, but no one respected. And and I, it was just like one of those weird whimsies of mine, but I eventually kind of got rid of that. But yeah, I just like the idea of these process servers. The lawyers they kind of depend on them, but they're viewed so differently than other colleagues of their own.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a sort of Kafkaesque tone. It's very mild, but it's there. I mean, it's this very kind of labyrinthine existence that people live in once they walk into this law building, and Francis is trying to, navigate or negotiate that. But how did you do the research for it? Where did this come from? Why?
Well,
why a law firm?
I mean, talking about the law firm is like, when you go to a wedding and you ask someone who you've never met before what they do for a career, and you're not supposed to do that because it's just it's kind of a lame question to ask.
That's all everybody does in Toronto, though.
Right, and for other reasons, it helps place people in their mind of like what kind of status, what kind of lifestyle. But I'm actually like genuinely interested in that. In almost all cases, people are describing a very complicated world that I would never understand unless I lived through it. And whether it's a law firm or something else, there are pressures that are invisible to any outsider. So as the law firm has its own set of rules and its own sort of odd eccentricities, the same with any other job, really. So I'm the kind of dope that is actually interested in talking about people's boring jobs when I'm at a wedding.
So did you just pick up all of this stuff from talking to people who were lawyers, or?
I think so. It's really hard for me to remember why. I do remember this one thing that might be a bit telling. I've worked in office jobs, certainly, but not in a law firm, and I've worked with lawyers. I used to work in the Ontario government as a policy advisor. That was kind of my last position. So I sort of, some of the stuff that I would write, I would pass through lawyers, but it was a very not kind of an impersonal relationship. Like I would often deal with lawyers that I would never meet. I would just send it off to their email address and get comments back. So it's not from that. It's not from my own job directly. But I do remember working and reading an article. I can't remember. It was some sort of Canadian publication, but it was about a woman's career as a corporate lawyer and sort of the toll it took on her and leading up to her leaving the job. And it was a very dramatic article. It was it was kind of a scene-oriented article. There was one, you wouldn't call it a scene if you were writing as a journalist, but it was really a visual scene. I think she worked through the night. Her managing partner drove her home. This is probably in New York, and he dropped her off. It's like 5 a.m. They've succeeded in getting some important filing done, and then he just tells her straight up that she should not follow up on this career. And that's a rarity for a managing partner to do that, because they depend on these lawyers to be there for them. But I remember reading it, and for some reason there are just certain emotional aspects of it that they kind of felt relatable to me. So there's something in that I was interested in. at the same time, later on, I think I've had a couple of friends who have become lawyers. Some friends who have supported lawyers as support staff. So I ask them a lot of questions, and whenever I meet someone who's they seem to have a lot of really interesting anecdotes, I ask them if I can interview them.
Got it.
For my comics, and I'm always surprised when they say yes. But
Got it.
But yeah, I enjoy doing a lot of research. Almost like, to be honest, I think I enjoy doing that as a distraction from actually writing.
I know what that's like. And of course, it's just, knowledge is just addictive too, right?
Coming up, why did Ethan focus his story on two women? The burning question, why Pope hats? And wait, what? His name isn't Ethan Rilly? Depending on the app you use, you can probably now see the entire Deconstructing Comics feed in your podcast app. I found that it appears in Apple Podcasts, but Stitcher and Pocket Casts don't quite go all the way back. The last 3 episodes you should see would be 126, 123, and 119. I'm working to fill the gap between those episodes and get as far back as 116. Want me to go back further? Support Deconstructing Comics on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. If our monthly donation total moves up just a few more dollars, we'll reach our next goal, and I'll be obligated to make episodes 101 to 115 available again. Become a patron and get access to additional audio and video at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather make a one-time donation, you can do so through PayPal. Send it to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
This continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
This is a spoiler warning. If you're planning to read Pope Hats number 5 and don't want the ending spoiled, skip ahead 30 seconds. Right now.
Just the story you were telling me right now, the one that you said was kind of a telling story, reminded me of towards the end of issue 5 when I was reading those pages where Frances is driving in the truck with Peter, and I was so sure she was going to go in and say, I'm not going to take the position. Mm-hmm. But yet you had her take the position.
That's a big...
Did you ever waffle? I don't care about spoilers. I fucking hate that term. Sorry.
Okay, well, I guess we should warn readers that...
Sorry.
that they should pretend they didn't hear that if they haven't read issue number 5 yet.
Oh, we could just talk about something else. Let's talk about something else.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, since that's sort of the ending of the story, I'd rather not discuss in detail.
Yeah. I mean, I did want to come back to the story, just in general, the story the tones or whatever. But then to go back to the other thing you were talking about, you wanted to deal with this thing about being in a law firm. And I don't know if you see it this way, but when I think of Kafka, or I think of who's the guy who wrote Sexus, and Arthur Miller, right? Like, there's a sense of like
guy who wrote Sexus? What?
Well, Arthur Miller, not Arthur Miller, Henry Miller.
Henry Miller.
Sorry,
of cancer. Okay.
Sorry, yeah. But when they deal with this kind of corporate thing, I feel like that's sort of a little bit of what you're doing. You're kind of making some kind of statement about what it's like to navigate these corporate pyramids. And in this time and place, in the early 21st century in Toronto, which is very much glued to that kind of culture. I don't know if you're consciously doing it, but I feel like you're evoking that time and place. And to me, that stuff that you're doing is more what your book is about than the actual story. Because I think the story moves in very small waves, very small movements. It doesn't move in big arcs, which is why I wasn't sure if it had ended. I wasn't sure if you were thinking of collecting it as a graphic novel. Because I see your strengths as a writer very much coming out of a short story sensibility as opposed to like a novelistic sensibility.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, that could do with context. Once I collect the story, it might be really clear once you read through everything at once.
Did you plan it all ahead, or did you just kind of?
No, I mean, it's always meant to be a 3-issue story.
And you plan the arcs, like, even before you?
Not exactly. I would plan the segment by segment, because, I mean, it would be impossible to write it all at once. If I did write it all at once, I would have released it as one graphic novel instead of putting it out piecemeal. These things take me years to make.
But Tomine works the same way. Like, he did Shortcomings as, like a year apart for each installment. But
I'm not sure if he wrote the whole thing at once. But, everyone's different. I don't... Like, I mean, to be honest, my closest friends in comics, they work extremely differently than me. I think I'm sort of the outlier with them. So for me, it's like, whatever works. I wanted to try my hand at a longer story, and it would have been impossible to work on writing the whole story at once. I mean, it took me years to write, or not quite years, but a very long time to write just this last 64 pages or so. So I do have an idea, and I certainly have... Yeah, I mean, like, I do have a sense of where things are going, but I'm actually quite, it's like, I'm kind of surprised by how closely I've stuck to my original intent. Like, it actually worked out quite well as a writer. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question there.
Well, let's take a look at the short story thing. Like, Seth mentions in his letter that your pacing is excellent. And you have that gift even from the first issue onwards. Where do you get that sensibility from? How do you try lots of different options and then decide on something? Or do you meticulously just, I don't know, like, it's so well done. And I think also just the sense of framing and pacing, those two things go together so well.
Well, thanks for the compliment. I don't know what to say about that. Like, it's, if there's anything that seems like it's working out on the page, when I'm making it work, it doesn't have that same emotional feeling for me. It feels very forced, and it is very forced. It's very orchestrated. And it takes a lot of, work, and I have to work through a lot of angst to get it the way I want it to be. But what I'm aiming for, of course, is just, for it to be a readable story. I want to be able to communicate the things I want to without telling the reader exactly what to think, but to give them hints of, the humor here and, the characterization here, and sort of something that they should be paying attention here in terms of plot. Pacing wise, I don't know. I think it might just be from like watching too many movies or something, but I do certainly care about, like, if things are moving too quickly or too slow, moments you should sort of telescope onto. all of that is sort of part of my writing process.
Sure. What about the choice to have two female characters? I feel like, once again, you're working in a tradition. I can't help but think of Maggie and Hopi, and also of Terry Moore's stuff, although I never really liked Strangers in Paradise. I feel it's part of that tradition. Did you ever feel any uncertainties about being a male, structuring your story around two women, and especially, identifying, I think, more with Frances, or how do you approach that?
Well, in the beginning, I did a mini comic a long time ago, and it was just about two girls, and it was a very short story. It was probably like 12 one-panel pages, maybe the first comic I ever really worked on. And it was just about these two girls. One had black hair and one had blonde hair, and that's how you could contrast them.
Betty and Veronica.
Yeah, one was named Frances, and the other was named Vicky, and that story was just about being in your early 20s and a birthday of yours approaching and having to kind of organize your own birthday, and that being both humiliating but also kind of an obligation. It's like you want to go out and celebrate.
But do you observe a lot of your female friends, or do you feel like it's fine for it's just
I
putting
observe
yourself...
all the ladies. No, I don't know.
Who does it?
Well, I mean, I don't really think there's too much of a distance to bridge in terms of the genders, and I also think that it's kind of weird to think that you would only be able to really write from your own perspective. But all the emotional stuff is the same. I've had the same career anxiety that Frances has had, and also the same kind of irresponsible partying that Vicky has kind of gone through in terms of that phase of her life. The fact that they're women, I don't know, certainly there's some things that I can't write about, and maybe I haven't heard a lot from readers about whether it seems unrealistic, but
I don't think it does.
If there's certain stuff that you just don't have to focus on in terms of story. So I'm sure there are things in the female experience that I would never be able to write in a million years.
Right.
But who knows? I've always been, I've always had platonic female friends. It hasn't always been a big deal to me. Some of my closest friends are girls. So yeah, I just don't see it as much of a big deal. I don't remember, to go back to the mini comic that I did, I don't really remember making a conscious decision to write women. But, the most intensive story would be number 5, where there is something I'm kind of exploring there in terms of women in career.
Right. I want to ask you about the art style. How did you, and once again, you'll probably say it's organic or something that just naturally evolved, but I do see that the style that you use for the characters is different than the style that you use for the backgrounds. I love the backgrounds, the texture, and once again, it's the framing, and you just get it so right. You've captured Toronto so well. But the characters themselves are a bit more cartoony, especially the faces. I even think of not like indie comics. There's a bit of clouds in there, I suppose, but even stuff like Little Lulu or something with the pointed noses and the really kind of cartoony eyes and stuff. And then you've got Cast On Guy, who's pretty much right out of a Chester Brown comic. So how do you make these choices for your art style?
Yeah, it's strange because the references that I guess a reader would pull up in their imagination are probably things I wouldn't be thinking about when drawing and designing characters. It's really hard to describe the process of arriving at a style. I think and I'm actually kind of embarrassed to admit I don't really read a lot of comics. I find it hard to keep up with even just what my friends are doing. So the influences in terms of style are probably, it's probably just something I carry with me from years ago, from before I actually started drawing comics. I grew up on Peanuts, and I love that stuff. Calvin and Hobbes. I mean, I can't even think of, I definitely don't consciously think of certain artists, because I know that would be a trap. I would be, if I was ever trying to mimic or do anything as good as Chester, it would be an outright failure from the start. So you just kind of, a lot of the drawing, and I think style is really, for me at least, it's just problem solving. It's like, how do I describe this set of gestures and facial expressions and emotions in a way that's not distracting to what I want to express? So if I focus a bit too much on kind of like, how many hairs are in an eyebrow, that would be distracting to what I want to get across. And also there's a thing about speed. I want, you to read a character really quickly. I want it to be kind of pure emotion, and then the context is whatever they're saying. So I want that to be accessible and to be fast. Backgrounds tend to be a bit more detailed. That's where, it's like, I almost think that it's unconscious. I think that people will read a background really quickly without really dwelling on it, and I like that. It's like I want things to move, but I also want to kind of create this sort of set for the world that's something that I can understand. It's like a lot of these locations in Toronto are, I have certain emotional attachments to, and when I think about writing scenes, it's always kind of really, it's weirdly specific. It's like I'll think about, Francis talking to someone outside of work, and I'll know exactly what part of Toronto that's going to take place at, and for some reason, it can't be anything else. It has to be that.
And I recognize those places, the ING Tiger, that
right.
Christie Pitts. I mean, I totally evokes those places.
It's like there would be, it's not to say that the reader has to have ever been to Toronto to get it, but there's probably another version of Popats, which is just, the liner notes version, where I explain in footnotes all of my, personal experiences with these places and why it makes sense for these characters to be, and in those places. And a lot of these anecdotes that these characters go through are probably, half-based, or, some kind of weird artsy version of what's happened to friends and what they've done, stupid or smart. It's all kind of things that I carry with me, a lot of it is, with affection.
I totally know what you mean, because I try to write about Toronto too, and I can totally recognize it in your stuff. I see you checking your watch, but you have to finish your drink as well.
No, I'm just getting cold.
Are you?
Yeah, it's a little chilly out
here. Put on your jacket, or if whatever you need to do. It is a very rainy, long weekend, at least today. So, do you just exclusively use brushes, or do you use marker and brush? Do you use a computer at all? I don't feel like you do, but...
Yeah, it's mostly like, it's old school. I just put ink on paper. I'll use any tool that helps me do that,
including markers.
Yeah, I use like
graphs.
I use like, I don't know, a ton of different, like, it's never just one pen. It's like a set of them, and it's I use a lot of rulers too. I think that's cheating, but whatever. And then I try not to use the computer at I try to use it as little as possible, because like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's great to be efficient, but I just I don't enjoy it very much. So I do coloring on the computer. I do touch-ups, in terms of like removing dust from the page, and if I've like crossed lines with my inking, sometimes I can fix little mistakes like that. And with lettering too, but I kind of like, I just don't enjoy where my mind goes when I'm on the computer doing this for like 10 hours a day. It's just like I feel rotten and inhuman. But so I kind of, like, I know that you can pencil, you can ink, you can do everything on the computer, but that seems like very, very torturous to me, which is, to add that difficulty on top of a very prolonged, protracted process already, you have to kind of make it enjoyable for yourself. So I like to draw just in a very antiquated fashion, right on paper.
Cool. Why the title Pope Hats? Is that something from long ago when you did your mini comic and you kind of would change now, or what, does it have a meaning?
It doesn't really have a meaning. It's kind of a long story. The short version of it is just a senseless, catchy title. It's like
Yummy Fur.
Exactly. It's like a nonsense title.
Right.
And it's not supposed to be taken literally at all. It's humorous. It's a bit irreverent. I like status symbols. I think they're funny. But I guess the longer version is, I think, it began, I used to do this little art thing on the side when I had my office job. I kind of needed some sort of outlet to amuse myself. So every Monday I did this thing for half a year. I would send out a mass email. This is kind of like early on, like when, I guess, Blogger was the main thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't Blogger. I just wanted to send sort of a mass email to people I knew, my friends. So it was like it's a closed group of maybe, 50 people. And it was called Pope Hats. And every Monday I would send out kind of like a sketchbook drawing or like a little comic or something. And it would always be different every week. And people started to really look forward to them because I think they were in the same position as me. They had, they'd finished university. They were in some kind of very bizarre work environment, but they could rely on, every Monday morning they would get this email from me of some nonsense drawing. And that was called Pope Hats. So years later, when I was thinking of doing an ongoing comic book, I was like, oh yeah, I like that title. I'll stick with it.
Okay, cool. And there must be photos of you now floating around on the internet. Is that correct, or?
Yes. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't.
The reason why I asked.
I haven't Googled myself in 5 hours, so I don't know.
The reason you're not like Lena Dunham. The reason why I ask is because of your name, your pseudonym. I had no idea you were Asian when I read it. I thought you were a white dude, and I was like...
one person came to me, I think this was around Pope Hats 2 or 3. This one guy came to me, and he was like, I really thought you were like a 50-year-old man, like white, balding man. And I took that as a compliment. I loved that. It's like, I want people to think that I'm not white, but a very old, crotchety man who has a lot more life experience than I do.
But why that pseudonym? Did it come up from when you were at the McGill Daily and you didn't want your friends to know you were...
I think that's exactly right. I was doing comics, and it was exactly the opposite of what I was there for. But also, it's weird to start doing art. It's a very vulnerable place you put yourself in because, I think I've heard this about sports, working in, being a professional ball player. The thing you have to learn is not to be good, but to practice in public. And that's something that's very difficult for artists. It's very, very embarrassing to be bad. And you can't start in any other way. You have to be bad. So, I never, when I was doing...
That's very profound.
When I was doing comics for the Daily, of course, no one gave a shit. It's the least important thing in the world. But at the same time, I didn't want anyone I knew or hung out with to know that I was doing these comics that they might find totally unfunny. And so I started doing them, and then I think after a couple years, I was like, hey, those comics, I do them. I told a couple of friends, and they were like, oh, that's so awesome. And then and I was having a good time by then, but the pseudonym has always helped. And it's when I was a professional and when I was working for the government, it was very helpful to keep those worlds separate. I think, to be honest, I think generally it depends on what kind of artist you are. Some people are really, they use pseudonyms to build a persona, and I'm kind of the opposite. I think I want to stay away from the spotlight, and I probably shouldn't be doing this interview. but I'm pretty private, so it suits me.
I do get the sense that you're a bit reluctant, which is why I kind of texted you and I said, if you don't want to do it, I totally understand. But I'm glad you've done it, because I think your stuff's very rich and you are talented. And I like interviewing people whose work I like, period. So I guess the last thing I should ask you is, now that you finished the story with Francis and Vicky, what are you mulling about for the future or the next issue? Or
yeah, I have an idea what I'm going to be doing. I have no idea when I'm going to start working on it. But I'm just staring at you. Do you have a parking violation here?
It's a goofy pencil case. I'm a total nerd. I carry my cell phone around.
Sorry, I got distracted. So I'm working on. I have an idea of what I'm working on. It's too early to talk about, but I'm going to be writing a lot. I think in the next year. That's all I can say.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, Ethan. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your stay here.
Yeah, thanks, Koom.
Yeah.
It was nice talking to you.
You can buy issues of Pope Hats at popehats.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look us up on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Critiquing Comics is released on the second and fourth Thursdays of the month, right here in this podcast feed. Last Thursday on To the Bat Polls, Kumar joined Paul and me to talk about the Batman manga that came out here in Japan in 1966. And this coming Thursday, we discuss Tallulah Bankhead as the Black Widow. Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. DC recently ended its 12-issue run of Mark Russell and Steve Pugh's social commentary take on the Flintstones. Next week, I'll be discussing the series with John Robertson, and we're joined by artist Steve Pugh himself to talk about how the series came about, some background on how it was designed and drawn, that time Steve accidentally drew a pinup of a dog's butt, and much more. So be here next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.